Hello, and good evening, and welcome to our webinar on tree pruning and other maintenance. Before we begin, I'd like to thank our sponsors, the Indiana Arborist Association. Ashley Mullis will be moderating questions at the end of the presentation. And then, of course, Purdue Extension, the Department of Forestry and Natural Resources for their support in putting on these webinars. So we'll get right into it. My name is Lindsey Purcell. I'm the Urban Forestry Specialist at Purdue University and also the Executive Director of the Indiana Arborist Association. I teach in the Forestry and Natural Resources Department with the teach urban forestry and arboricultural science. And part of my job is outreach and engagement and teaching professionals and tree owners about how to manage trees in the built environment. So let's get right into it. We have a lot of material to cover. There'll also be a survey at the end of the presentation for those especially who are credentialed arborists in order to get your certification education units. All right, let's get right into our presentation. Okay, today we're going to talk about tree pruning essentials, and really there's nothing basic about pruning. It's a critical arboricultural practice that can be beneficial or detrimental depending upon your knowledge of this intervention or this activity. Science-based pruning, making good decisions on the type of pruning system that you're using and pruning cuts help trees reach maturity and become more sustainable, functional elements in the landscape. Poor pruning practices simply shorten trees' lives and create health issues and future maintenance issues. So understanding good pruning cuts is very important to the future of the tree. Now, trees have lived a very long life in nature. They don't become the oldest living organisms on the planet without having some very critical strategies in order to survive, especially in the urban environment. However, they need a little care, especially in the urban forest. So regardless of the size, trees are going to require pruning in order to be compatible with its environment. And there's a lot of things that happen in the urban environment that create the need to conform or perhaps adjust to buildings and things around, especially when it comes to risk. Things that we need to think about and we'll discuss in this presentation include improving tree architecture, meaning branch structure and its form, how to establish proper branch spacing and where that should be, looking at sustainable branch attachments and what makes a branch attachment have greater strength than others. But one thing about caring for trees, obviously you're not going to be, most of you aren't going to be hanging from a 11 millimeter rope with a saw pruning a mature tree, but a lot of you owned or manage trees that are very big and it's dangerous work and you need to know when to contact an ISA arborist. I guess I would be a little bit remiss if I didn't talk about the right tree, right place. So good pruning actually starts with good planning and choosing the right tree. The goal is to minimize inputs and maximize the benefits that trees provide. And this starts with proper tree selection and placement. Planning for the right tree in the right place reduces that need for continual pruning. Understanding the mature size of the tree for its location, determine if it'll be fit in the intended space as it matures and grows before planting. Reduced maintenance plantings are the goal for everyone, and this also includes smart selection of good quality material. Choosing trees is much like purchasing any product. You get what you pay for, and the tree you select can determine those long-term maintenance responsibilities that you may have. Start out right whenever you're planting a tree by purchasing it from a reputable source, such as a dedicated nursery or garden center. Then recognize how to choose trees that are healthy, vital, good branch structure and spacing to begin with. Don't buy and plant any trees with a lot of narrow branch angles or excessive branching, or other structural issues, which we'll talk about how to identify those. And make sure you got the appropriate species for the situation. We want to think about long-term site considerations. Excuse me. Pruning has often been called one of the best worst maintenance practices on trees, but it's often a necessary process for safety, aesthetics, health, and conformity. When I talk about aesthetics, I'm talking about improving appearance of the plant, and conformity is more about if the tree has exceeded its capacity or its limited space or capacity within the bounds of the design, then oftentimes it needs pruned to fit to eliminate structural conflicts or things that, for example, growing into a building or perhaps blocking a street sign or something like that. And that also leads to utility vegetation management as well as far as clearance. We want to make sure that the trees are not interfering with utility lines so that there is good service and safety and reliability involved with your utilities. Utility foresters are some of the best arborists around, and they have a very keen knowledge of trees and their growth habits and patterns and safety with trees around utilities. So be sure to consult them if you have some type of infrastructure conflict with your utility lines. And this also leads to safety. Reducing the risk of failure is one of the most important reasons or objectives for pruning. And also, every time we prune, we should be thinking about plant health care, creating a sustainable, stable structure in our landscape. This next page is what I'd like to talk about, is called what I call important generalizations about pruning that apply to nearly every situation. So at the very least, anytime you prune, which is an intentional wounding of the plant, you're altering the morphology, which is the shape of the tree, as well, and you're also changing the physiology of the plant. Some very important things happen within the tree. Pruning is an external stimulus, and it elicits a response within the plant. Hormonal response, resource allocation, a lot of things change within the plant whenever we wound it through pruning. We talk about how much we take off the tree. Arborists know that there's a certain percentage of live green tissue that is suggested that is good for the tree whenever you are pruning. But it's also important to be concerned about what's left on the tree, because that will have an effect on the biomechanics or the response of the tree to wind loading or snow accumulation or ice accretion on the tree. It's also important to know that small cuts do less damage to the tree than larger cuts. Younger trees have an increased amount of sapwood and more effective at sealing or healing these pruning cuts or wounds than trees that require larger cuts. The older the tree gets, the harder it is for it to heal from these pruning wounds. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that later on in the presentation. This leads to the concept and proven principle that formative pruning or early young tree pruning, or sometimes called training, is critical in order to establish a good stable structure. It's also much more economical from the fact that you can do all the pruning basically from the ground. If you have a defect in the tree and you wait and it waits and it waits, and then the tree gets larger, then you often have to have specialized equipment and a professional arborist to come in and take care of the issue. Proper technique is essential for recovery. That means implementing good pruning cuts. And we're going to spend a good deal of time on how to make those cuts, which will help recovery from those pruning wounds. And also talk a little bit about timing, when's a good time to prune, and how developmental age impacts pruning response. All right, let's move forward. So what are your goals? there's got to be a reason why you're pruning. And pruning objectives specify what those goals are for this activity. No trees really should be pruned without some clearly defined objectives. And oftentimes, if you're a tree owner, you're going to be asked. You call an arborist and they say, my tree needs pruned. Well, the best question is why? Why does it need to be pruned? For example, this tree in the background obviously has some health issues. We might require some removal of some dead branches in order to improve safety or also improve health. But trees are pruned for a reason. Trees grow quite well without our intervention. But again, in the built environment, we often need to make some adjustments there to make the tree a little safer or a little healthier. So know those objectives before you start the pruning process. This starts with newly established young trees. I would say the landscape industry and tree owners or homeowners that are planting new trees have the biggest impact on the future of our urban forests and our trees if they know how to properly prune these newly established young trees. And this is the easiest. Structural pruning is one of the best ways to reduce tree failure and maintaining that dominant leader, which is so important. It's much more economical. As I mentioned earlier, in our principles, smaller wound size and healing time, and often we are able to better distinguish what needs to be pruned. Again, as I mentioned, in younger trees, there's a greater amount of sapwood, which facilitates the sealing or healing process. Older wood behind pruning cuts turn into heartwood, and they don't have the phytochemicals and the ability to close that wound quickly and effectively. Many defects that cause tree failures can be eliminated in the tree's early development maintenance program. Trees not receiving any type of formative pruning during these early stages in life are more likely to have structural defects that we'll show you here shortly that increase the likelihood of failure, either in part or in whole. So it's great to invest a little time to select trees for planting that have good branch structure or create that through structural pruning. That time and investment ensures a safe, structurally sound tree and decreases future maintenance costs that can be hundreds or even thousands of dollars. Here's what I was talking about when I was talking about poor branch structure. Now, this is just a common tree that you see in any landscape. This is a bur oak, beautiful size, developing quite well, but there's an issue. And the trained arborist can often see what that is. And this is what I'm talking about. This is what I'm discussing earlier with leaders. You know, trees should have a central dominant leader system. And when you have two here, you have a higher likelihood of failure because of the poor branch aspect ratio. That's a term that we'll discuss here shortly. And they come in all sizes. This is what this will turn into if this is not corrected during its early establishment period or more juvenile developmental age. So here you can see this is a 1-to-1 branch aspect ratio, and you can see this is almost like a perfect slingshot. Well, what will happen is some very, very critical concerns as far as risk goes. As trees parts become larger, their likelihood of failure can increase as well. And what happens is these trees split due to this poor structure. So this was an ash tree that this homeowner had been treating because, as you can see, this is the only tree in her front yard, and it's very important to her and her site because she's depending upon that for some ecosystem services, more specifically shade. But the problem was she selected a tree or did not do any structural pruning during an early developmental age, and you can see that she's got codominant or multi-stemmed structure here. Now, as I mentioned earlier, this is not such a big deal whenever you're looking at smaller trees, but as these parts grow larger, they grow heavier, and this load on the defect becomes greater. and with the right wind from the right direction, or perhaps the right amount of ice or loading on the limbs, causes the tree to split. And what happens is it leaves the homeowner frustrated and uncertain of what to do with the situation once it's happened. Could it be cabled or braced? Potentially, it could be a candidate for that. However, at this age and stage in its life, I'm not sure that it's worth the investment there. It might be just as well to spend that money in replacing that tree and getting a more sustainable tree structure. These are what we call codominant stems, and they may or may not have bark inclusion, which is this area here. So what happens is you've got two branches in the tree that are competing for the same job in the tree as the dominant leader. Almost every tree has a dominant leader that is found in the tree, but oftentimes due to poor branch infrastructure, they lose that due to the codominance. What happens is bark gets trapped in this tree, which leads to decay. It also results in cracked trunks and branches, as you saw earlier. Not only can stems have it in trunks, but also branches can have the same situation as well. And scientists have determined that trees are significantly more weak whenever we have these codominant stems, and even more so when we have decay in the trunk. One of the most popular ones that we see splitting due to these codominant stem issues is ornamental pear. They're extremely prone to splitting, very brittle wood. I don't recommend nurturing these or actually managing these because they're highly invasive. They're destroying our natural ecosystems. And my suggestion is to always remove and replace if it's at all possible, because this is what's certainly going to happen. Now, not that an ornamental pear can't be pruned to maintain a dominant leader, but it has to be done very early in its life or you lose that window very quickly. This is irreparable damage to the tree. This is another tree in a neighborhood. Again, the only tree in the front yard, very important, significant element in the landscape. And one of the things that was very critical with this is the fact that you can see that it does have that codominant. You can see the branch that failed is actually very similar in size, almost a 1-to-1 ratio of its twin here. And remember, we talked about the codominance and the included bark you can see on the edges, and the decay that occurred as a result of that. So all of those things happen, as I mentioned earlier, and this is what leads to that failure. It is predictable and it is preventable with good pruning. So predictable as far as when will it happen, we're never certain of that, but it's not a matter of when or if, it's a matter of when. So that tree splitting can happen anytime the right loading, dynamic loading is present to create an issue or on that defect. So what do we do about it? What's the next best step? Well, again, this is another similar tree. Again, beautiful oak tree in a neighborhood in West Lafayette. And what happens is we've recognized this codominant. And is it too late for this? Well, not really. If the diameter of that codominant stem gets a little too big, or not a recently planted tree that could be clipped off very easily, then the stem should be reduced and not really removed. This reduction slows the growth rate on the cut stem, which helps the developing branch to become stronger, taller, and receive more resources. So what we want to do is not necessarily cut the entire branch off here if we choose this particular leader. This is a very difficult decision, but not a really tough one because they're both pretty vertical. And that's what we want to choose, is the most vertical branch. But this one because we will be removing nearly half, or at least half, of the total canopy, we want to make sure that we don't exceed pruning doses. And so we may want to suppress this tree by subordinate pruning in a stage of a couple of different pruning sessions. So we may cut in this area the first year and then maybe completely remove the second year to give that tree time to adjust. And oftentimes this will improve the situation without too much stress on the tree. So this is what our goal. Now, this is a red oak in the same neighborhood. And, you know, they're not always going to be perfectly straight like this. This is just the perfect excurrent or upright form that red oaks typically have, especially when they're younger. But the problem is we're not always going to find them like this, and we have to create them through structural pruning. But again, this is the kind of goal to keep in mind when we're trying to improve that branch structure to obtain that dominant leader system. Now, I mentioned earlier a little bit about branch aspect ratio regarding branch attachment strength. Now, in the field, we need to consider the strength of those codominant stems and attachments where branch diameter is much larger than the supporting stem to the parent stem. That's when we have the greater likelihood of failure. So, well, our goal is to have a 2-to-1 ratio of the parent branch to the tertiary branch. Excuse me. So if we're pruning to create stronger structures, we want to make sure that you can tell as go from the stem to the main branches to the kind of the secondary branches. As we get smaller, we want to make sure that these also get smaller as well and maintain a 2-to-1, or this should be less than 50% of the size of this tree. Those small aspect ratios are super important for strong branch union. It improves stability, and we have a decreased likelihood of failure. So this is an example of a more mature branch that I cut in a maple tree earlier. And if we look at the attachment, we can see it's got a good branch angle, which used to be our determining factor for whether or not that was a good attachment. But research has indicated that's more about the aspect ratio. And you can see this is a poor branch aspect ratio because it's nearly 1-to-1. So if this was the main branch or even the main trunk, depending upon whether it's a tree or a branch, this is too large for this parent stem to actually support. So we'll either need to subordinate this or we'll need to remove it in order to improve that stability. Because if this gets cracked or breaks off, it's going to split clear down into the stem and create an even bigger issue. Here's another example of poor branch aspect ratio. This is a codominant stem, again, with a 1-to-1 ratio, and you can see that they've been together for so long, growing codominantly, that they've got not only included bark, but you can see the decay that's accumulating in here and getting increasingly worse, which also increases that likelihood of failure as well. And as the tree gets larger, as I mentioned, this is our defect, which is the codominant stems, almost a perfect 1-to-1 ratio. And you can see, as I mentioned earlier, as those parts get larger, then the load on the defect gets greater or increases as well. And the thing that leaves, again, homeowners frustrated is the fact that this could have been prevented. If I were planting this tree, knowing what I do now, I would not even have allowed it to be planted because it's such a poor branch structure. It could have been pruned to improve that situation. But again, choosing a plant with good branch structure to begin with eliminates a lot of headaches. And also the one thing that this cannot be mitigated or cannot be repaired. And the other thing is how much time has been lost waiting for this tree to get to a functional size where it actually does provide some benefits, such as shade or cooling or improved water or air quality. Once they get to a functional size, then they split and then they have to be removed. And we've lost all that time. And now we have to wait for another tree to gain and catch up and get to the size where it is providing some benefits. So there's a lot of losses in this situation. And again, it is preventable and predictable. All right, let's talk about the types of pruning based on objectives that are common in our landscapes. So Pruning for safety is probably one of the most important. Reducing the likelihood of failure is very important to protect nearby targets. When I'm talking about nearby targets, I'm talking about homes or buildings, sidewalks, cars on the street. People are the most important target. When you see a dead branch like this, oftentimes they become dislodged during a wind. We can be proactive by getting up there and cleaning out or clearing out those defects in the tree. Now, while we're up there, we may be pruning for health by removing this as well, and also crossing branches, things like that. But the one thing we want to make sure we do is identify and mitigate those defects. And then that lowers the likelihood of failure for that tree and also improves the health as well. Pruning for improved tree health should be a goal every time we prune a tree. We need to focus on those non-beneficial plant parts, and we'll talk about what those look like. Those are things like epicormic sprouts or suckers, or damaged or declining or dead branches. We can also have an impact on the tree health from a pest control perspective. Oftentimes in the summer, we'll see those webbed tent caterpillars growing on the ends of the branches or bagworms. By simply pruning those off or picking those off, eliminates the need for a pesticide application, saving money and also impact on the environment. Size management pruning is another one. Oftentimes, as I said, conformity is a major objective or reason for why we prune. Oftentimes trees exceed their space that they were planned or intended for in the design, and as a result, they have to be pruned. So this has been called crown reduction or size reduction, but our new management practices indicate that size management pruning is the best description for this type of objective. So basically what we're doing is pruning to reduce the size or spread of the tree. We can also, in that process, improve branch architecture through either subordination or reduction cuts. But what we're trying to do is improve the structure of the tree, and in that process, we're going to control its size or shape. As I mentioned, trees sometimes grow larger than desired, either for aesthetic or safety issues. They also interfere with overhead utility wires. And so if we can control this through peripheral pruning, that means pruning with reduction cuts to appropriate lateral on the ends, then we can properly manage the size of that tree. Never remove anything on the interior. Now, there's obvious reasons why they did for this particular home, either to see the house or to be able to see from inside the house. However, what this does is create a higher likelihood of failure. This pruning practice is an improper type of pruning called lion's tailing. And what it means is we're actually pushing the center of mass of these branches and this live green tissue out towards the perimeter of the tree or the periphery of the tree, which increases the loading on the branch attachments. So in the wind, that means this is going to sway much more dramatically and have a higher likelihood of failure here at their attachment points. So make sure if you're reducing size, that you start reducing from the outside and not try to make reductions on the inside. Size management also includes elevating the crown in order to provide clearance. And this is not the way to do it. This is an excessive amount of raising, as well as this one. This was a row of Bradford pears on both sides at the entrance to a subdivision. You can see they removed an excessive amount of foliage. They didn't last long. In fact, it was kind of a good thing because these invasive ornamental pears got removed and replanted with a better species. This is an excessive amount. Again, we're moving that sail of the tree or the canopy of the tree up, which provides more of a bending moment on the tree, which increases the likelihood of failure. Whenever you're raising the crown, especially on sidewalks. Actually, the ADA compliance is 8 feet, but you want to try to maintain at least a 60-40 ratio. That means 60% crown to 40% stem, or an overall 60% canopy for that tree. So anytime we go above that, then we increase the likelihood of failure, and we also have an impact on health as well. When I talk about pruning, I have to say a little bit about topping. And if you run into a tree care company that advertises topping, tell them that they're misinformed and topping is bad for trees, and do not hire them. Topping is basically an indiscriminate internodal cutting, which removes an excessive amount of live green tissue, and it increases tree stress due to this excessive branch removal. We see a lot of decay, increase in defects, and because of this excessive pruning, it puts a tree into a hormonal resource frenzy. And so what you often see is a proliferation of growth, which is weakly attached and much more prone to storm damage. So topping is bad, and it's expensive to maintain, because the more you prune, the more it's going to grow, and you'll actually be creating an annual problem, as opposed to proper pruning for size management, which will reduce the need for pruning long term. So topping, remember that term is an inappropriate, unethical way to prune trees. As I mentioned earlier, we want to prune to a proper lateral. So a proper lateral means pruning that branch to a branch large enough to assume that terminal role. So if we're doing a reduction cut, we want to make sure that the next branch that we prune to, we always prune to a lateral. Whenever we prune that, we want to make sure that that branch can support the remaining stem. So you can see there's only 4 little leaflets on this, and so it's not a proper lateral, nor is it at least 1/3 the size of the diameter removed. This is a proper lateral. You can see this is about 1/3 to 1/2 the size of the remaining stem. And so this, whatever's out here, I'm sure will be able to support this. And so as a result, this is a correct way to prune. This will be incorrect. As you can see on this example, made a reduction cut to this on this stem, and you can see the remaining branch here is at least 1/3 to 1/2 the size of this. So that's a good pruning cut, because the remaining branch has to be able to support itself. All right, let's get into the pruning guidelines a little bit. So I asked my friend Jeff Harris, wonderful graphic artist, to talk about, or to draw me a tree that could probably have anything that you could think wrong with the tree. I want it in there so that we can talk about objectives and what we need to look at when we're pruning. I think he pretty much nailed it here. So again, there's 3 steps. When I teach pruning, I teach about 3 steps. First, what are your objectives? Why are we in that tree? Why do we need to prune it? Trees don't just grow up needing pruning. There has to be a reason. So I tell people to think about the functional aspects. If we take care of the health and safety or risk issues regarding tree pruning, 80% of what we need to accomplish can be done right there. So again, look for things like broken or dead branches, or perhaps dying branches. We may want to make some structural improvements with looking at the number of codominance there, but we need to think about how much live green tissue we're removing. Get rid of basal sprouts, these vertical growing epicormic sprouts, any weird irregular growth which is causing crossing branches, because that creates wounds on the branches, which could lead to decay. So once we get through looking at those functional aspects to improve health and safety, we pretty much accomplished our pruning goals or our objectives. And then step back and review. Take a look at how the tree appears. Think about how much is on the ground, live green tissue. Look to see what's left on a tree, and that may be time to stop. Now, it's possible that you need to go back next year and complete a little more pruning to achieve your objectives. but it doesn't all have to be done at once. So we need to think about how much we're taking off and what our objectives are, and then revisit those later on. How big a branch should we be cutting? Well, there's a lot of science and research that goes into this as well. Usually, especially on large, now I'm talking about medium-aged trees, not necessarily the smaller, newly established trees. But when you're looking from an arbor standpoint, if we're looking at large branches or large trees, under 2-inch diameter, you're not going to have too much of an impact biomechanically on the tree. Now, when we get to be 3 and 4 inches, we're removing some permanent scaffold branches, which are going to have an impact on its physiology and its morphology, which will affect its stability. Also, when you get into this larger diameter removals, we also have to think about recovery and the size of wound that we're creating there. Remember, the older and larger the branch, the more heartwood, less sapwood, and the more difficult and more slowly it recovers from that pruning wound, which can lead to decay and further health issues. So we need to really think about what we're removing. Now, most tree owners won't be worried about this. They'll hire a professional ISA arborist to take care of this. But again, and be cautious about what you remove, because once you take it off, you can't put it back on, unfortunately. We accomplish this through basically 2 types of cuts. Reduction cuts mean that you're basically removing the larger of 2 or more stems. So if this is a tree or a branch that we want to reduce the size, or perhaps this is interfering with a light or something of that nature, then we will reduce it, cutting it back to, remember I talked about the proper lateral, and you can see this is at least 1/3 to 1/2 the size of the stem being removed. So this will assume the terminal role. And actually you can see we're changing the directions of the growth as well. This is a removal cut. We're removing the smaller of 2 branches at the union. So if this is our parent stem, and let's say this is growing over the sidewalk and we're trying to improve size or clearance here, then we'll remove at this point here. So there's other types of cuts, but those are the 2 most common that we find that we're using in the landscape when it comes to pruning trees. As I mentioned earlier, regardless of your pruning a shrub or a tree, we can also have an impact on directional growth as well. But regardless of what you're pruning, we always want to prune to a lateral. And in this particular situation, if we're just doing some tip pruning or perhaps even shrub pruning, we want to make sure we prune back to the lateral bud. So if this is the terminal bud, this is the lateral bud, and you can see this is alternate arrangement. So we can actually change the direction of that growth. So when we make our cut, we're going to cut just above this, being careful not to damage that lateral bud. And so as a result, that tree is going to change directions in which it grows, because it's going to grow in a way that its bud faces. And you can see as a result of removing this, it also gave increased resources to this branch as well. So again, be sure to prune to a proper lateral or to a lateral bud in order to get the best results from your pruning cut. Now, when we're pruning woody stems, there's 2 very important identification points we need to make here. In order to make the proper pruning cut that's going to seal effectively and quickly, we need to identify the branch collar. And this is typically a swollen area on the underside of the branch that contains some very specific meristematic tissue that helps that tree to recover. Also, another very important component is to identify the branch bark ridge. Every single branch attachment has a branch bark ridge. Now, not every branch will have a noticeable branch collar, but oftentimes we can discern where that is without making poor cuts. And if we are going to remove this branch, this is where we would make our cut. Just outside the branch bark collar, or excuse me, branch bark ridge, and just outside the branch collar. No pruning inside of this area. This is what we call the branch protection zone. We'll talk a little bit more about that here shortly. And this is accomplished through what we call the ternary method or the 3-cut method. And it's basically 3 steps. We make an undercut, typically 3 to 4 inches outside of where the branch bark ridge is, or they attach it to the tree. Then we make our top cut, and our 3rd cut is removing that stub of the stem, leaving a good pruning cut, which hopefully, if the tree is healthy and vigorously growing, will turn into a good closure and basically issue-free wound. So if we were to look at this in summary, our first cut is usually about 1/3 into the stem. Again, it doesn't matter how far out you go here. We just don't want to get into this area here because we may run the risk of damaging the branch collar or the branch bark ridge. Then our second cut goes through, and it's typically, again, 1 or 2 inches outside of this undercut. And then, of course, our final cut is removing that stub. So if we're to look at it in real life on this red maple, see, we're gonna remove this offending branch here. It's in the way of mowing. So our first cut is our undercut, again, about 1/3 of the way up into the branch, using a pruning saw that's specifically made for tree pruning. Has a very specialized blade, what we call a tri-cut blade. Certainly worth the investment if you do a lot of pruning. And then the top cut. You can see the first cut, the undercut right here, and it's again about 1/3 up. And there's a purpose behind this, and you're going to see that soon. So whenever we start cutting this, gravity is going to take over. And beautiful image, if I do say so myself. You can see the purpose and the importance of this undercut. So had this not been made, if we just start cutting from the top, if this did not hit the ground, it would just rip all the way down and perhaps even into the trunk here, which would cause an even greater issue later on and a larger wound for that tree to heal. So that bottom cut is very, very important. Then, of course, step 3, the original name for this pruning method was called the double cut, which just included this area here. But people really took that literally and often left stubs. And what this is basically a conduit for decay. You've got wood here with no branches or leaves to support it, to keep it growing or alive. So it just decays and rots and eventually ends up into the column of the tree, creating a very high-risk tree. So again, with the 3rd cut, we go outside the branch bark ridge, outside the branch collar, and we make a beautiful pruning cut here. And hopefully, if the tree's vigorously growing and healthy, it'll seal this wound up very quickly without any incident to the tree. Now, the reason we don't want to damage or cut this area inside the branch bark ridge or branch collar is because this branch protection zone has some very important physiological features and phytochemicals that facilitate this healing or sealing process. So we want to make sure we don't damage that. So a lot of people like to cut right next to the branch, and you can see that does a couple of things. One, you get into that branch protection zone and reduce that tree's ability to heal, but we also are creating a larger wound. Remember, as I mentioned earlier, smaller wounds heal faster than those bigger wounds. And that's very critical to reduce the amount of decay that tree could potentially suffer as a result of those pruning wounds. So here's some examples of some improper cuts. So this is the ripping I was talking about. The person who was pruning just pruned from the top, and as the tree fell or the branch fell, it just ripped to a point where it eventually fell off. And you can see this would have been the normal pruning size wound, but now the tree has to heal from this entire open tissue area. Then, of course, flush cutting, you can see this is where you're pruning in. Do you see a branch bark ridge that remains? No. So it's been removed. There's no branch collar, and what it did was create a huge wound that this tree may or may not ever recover from. There's a lot of exposed tissue here that is subject to fungal organisms and decay, and is likely going to suffer some problems as this tree tries to recover. Then, as I mentioned, the stub cuts. Obviously, this branch was cut because of the traffic, so it doesn't hit cars. But they did the double cut. But again, you can see that this is starting to decay already, and so that's going to lead to decay that moves into the main column. And again, once this tree gets bigger and becomes more functional, we've got more health issues to deal with. So just one pruning cut right here can make a huge difference in the sustainability of that tree. All right, now let's kind of finish up here. We've made our pruning cut. Let's think about how the tree responds to these pruning wounds and think about how the tree recovers. Pruning dose makes a big difference in how that tree responds, because remember, when you're removing live green tissue, you're basically removing that tree's ability to produce food that creates energy and resources for recovering from its wounds and healing. Our objectives say that pruning should remove no more living material than is needed to achieve the objectives that we're there for. So why are we pruning? So don't do any more pruning than is necessary to achieve those objectives. And pruning dose is completely dependent upon the health of that tree and the vigor, its age, and the time of year. So the healthier the tree, the more aggressive we could potentially be with pruning live green tissue. The older the tree is, the less live green tissue we should be removing, and also the time of the year. The best time to prune is during the growing season, which facilitates faster healing. But we want to always focus on mitigating those non-beneficial plant parts, which really don't contribute to the pruning dose. If we're removing dead or dying limbs or epicormic sprouts or basal sprouts, that really doesn't count towards that live green tissue calculation. It's when we start removing some of these major branches up in the tree, with again, a lot of healthy leaves on it, that we really need to think about our pruning dose. And it may be necessary, as I mentioned earlier on the codominant stems, that we have to come back to finish our objectives because we don't want to exceed recommended pruning doses, which can be found right here. So again, this is sort of a number relevant to these items here. So tree health, age, and time of year will make a difference on how much of a pruning dose or live green tissue we can remove at any one time. But you can see the older it gets, the less we should be removing. So young, newly established trees that I say have been in the ground 3 to 5 years, we can get pretty aggressive with that because, again, they have more resources and more vigorously able to recover from that wounding. Medium age trees, that means, you know, you're looking at your trunk that's 12 to 15 inches across or more, about 25 to 30%. And then older trees, we really shouldn't be pruning any live green tissue unless we absolutely have a reason. This is what we want to see after pruning. And the time it takes to heal and seal up that wound is relevant, again, upon health, vigor, and species. Certain species heal very quickly and some move more slowly. And of course, the older the tree is, the more slowly it recovers. So the whole idea is to seal that wound, because once we make that wound with the pruning cut, the race is on. So the fungal organism is going to establish itself on that exposed tissue and start excreting its enzymes, decaying the wood while it's feeding on it. But the tree is in a race against time to try to seal that off to stop the fungal activity. And so you can see this one is fully recovered through, and what it does is compartmentalize or wall off that wound to protect against the fungal organisms. This maples, you can see the wound wood tissue starting to develop. We call this donut shape. You can see the branch has started to decay a little bit, but the idea is to get this to close completely, which seals off that fungal organism's ability to survive and move. So this is a good example of how long it could potentially take. This is a young, vigorously growing red maple in the nursery at Purdue. You can see at pruning time, this was 150 days later, and then 360 days later, you can see that it's almost fully recovered. So if it's young, vigorously growing, it can compartmentalize and prevent that decay from getting any worse. And again, that's our whole goal in the pruning process, is good, quick recovery. Let's talk about when to prune. Well, really, you can do it about any time the wood's not frozen. Sometimes it's better to prune during the dormant period or before the leaves emerge, especially if we have concern with pathogen transfers such as fire blight or oak wilt. Because the fungus is not active or the disease is not active, then we have less chance of transferring that to other trees. But also, we need to think about the biological timing as opposed to affecting growth and flowering. The best time to prune for maximizing growth and wound closure is during the early season flush. So if a tree, we're in a temperate zone, trees just flush. Shortly after that, affect our pruning, and we can also reduce the growth rate as well if that's an objective. But wound closure and growth is maximized if pruning takes place during the growing season. Pruning during the dormant season slows the recovery process, that research has shown, which may give an advantage to the fungal organism and slow that wound occlusion. So best time to prune is late spring, early summer, and then start slowing down your pruning activities until dormancy, or again, until that following spring. Now, if you have flowering trees or shrubs, you want to be careful there, because if we prune too early, we're pruning for what we've been waiting for the whole year. So our very important trees that prune, and trees and shrubs that prune, or excuse me, flower in the spring, if we prune too early, we're going to prune those flowers off, which is not good. And but the majority of our plants fall into this area here. There are some that should be pruned after flowering or after the end of June, before the new growth starts in the spring, but these are mostly shrubs, but the majority of our trees fall into this. So wait till after they bloom, and then start getting the pruning project going. I get asked a lot about wound dressing treatments that's still available and still used, but this is that black paint or paste that you put on pruning wounds, and research has found that this is very detrimental to healing. It does create some sort of a visual band-aid, if you will, for the plant, but it really doesn't do any good. In fact, it can be more harmful than good, and it slows that healing process. You can see the wound wood trying to develop here. This is a very large pruning cut. Same here, you can see starting to develop, but it's much slower than it normally would be had it not been treated. There are different types of pruning sealers. This is the type that we typically see in the hardware stores. Avoid this. This is probably the worst thing you could do to a pruning wound because it has petroleum distillates in it. And petroleum kills cells. And that's the antithesis of what we're trying to create. We want living cells to seal that wound off. Now, there are some other sodium silicate types of materials that actually act as a varnish, if you will, to go over a pruning wound. The idea is to keep the wound moist, keep the cells alive so that it recovers. Also, a natural material called lac balsam that a lot of professionals use. They swear by it, but I have not found any research to support the use of any type of wound dressing. Now, wound coverings have been suggested, especially on oak trees that are subject to oak wilt, because what we're trying to do is seal up that pruning wound so that the vectors do not spread the disease. So there are some exceptions from a pest management standpoint that where tree sealing is advantageous, but for the simple sake of wound recovery, it really doesn't help. All right, we'll just kind of finish up here. Again, prune with objectives. Make sure you understand why you're making those cuts. And the best way to get a tree to heal from pruning wounds is using proper cuts. Make sure that you know your tree, understand its developmental age, identify its health and vigor, the shape, whether it's excurrent or decurrent, or pyramidal growing, more upright growing, or wide round growing, because that'll make a difference in how you shape your tree. And one of my favorite phrases, and I tell my students this, is stay in your lane. If you don't know what you're doing, then ask. There's a lot of resources out there available, and a lot of professionals that are willing to assist. There's a wealth of information on the internet. A lot of things are fixed or attempted to be repaired through Googling or YouTubing, but there's a lot of bad information out there on the internet regarding tree care. I do a regular search for, because I'm curious, but it's also entertaining, but it's also a little bit scary. Remember, when you Google something, Google populates your search based on popularity, not necessarily credibility or correctness. And so be cautious of your resources. Make sure it's a credible resource and current as well. There's a lot of old resources out there that aren't current with research and practice. So make sure you're using good, credible resources and not just the first thing you look for. Oftentimes your land-grant universities such as Purdue provides up-to-date information on tree care and other types of concerns. And last, do like the dude, abide by the physiological demands of the tree. So prune based on what the tree needs, not necessarily what time best fits you or your schedule. Or it's spring, it's time to prune the tree. Well, the tree may not need it, or it's summer and you feel like you're bored or you need to prune, or well, it may not be the best time for the tree based on drought stress or other environmental stressors that could have an impact on the health of that tree. So if you kind of follow these principles, then you got a better chance of having a longer lived tree. And that's our whole objective, is for trees to last a lot longer and provide more benefits to us to improve our quality of life. So if you want some resources on pruning, a lot of what I talked about this evening came from a combination of these 3 publications available from the Purdue Education Store. This is a video that kind of briefly explains this presentation. Also, if you want to stay up to date on current emerging issues in landscape and tree care, the Purdue Landscape Report's available on Facebook and online. We have bi-weekly newsletters containing new publications and issues that are important for green industry professionals and arborists and nursery growers and homeowners as well. All this information can be found on the Purdue Extension website called the Education Store. This is the page that you go to. It might be a little challenging to find, but you want to look for urban tree care here. And all these are free downloads. You can either print them or keep them on your phone. There's many topics, from pest management to soil analysis to pruning to fertilization, available at that location. So I want to thank you all for joining us. Please be sure to complete the survey. Very shortly, you should receive an email with that information on there. And if you're a certified arborist, you can include this code to obtain 1 CEU for your certified arborist credential. Again, thank you for spending the evening with us to talk about pruning, and stay tuned for more webinars here in the very near future.